The first big concept is politeia. Politeia is the title. It's translated into English oftentimes as the Republic. But what does it mean? Politeia means, it's really trying to say, it's trying to say, what is the regime? What is really the thing in which persons and groups act together? And in which these actions are defined by a contract. If you study cultural anthropology, you will see, I think, that it's actually among the Aryans that they start to develop this notion of contract. Whether we're trading, so whatever I've made or whatever I've grown, and if I want to trade it with somebody else, I create a contract, and that contract, if you keep it, you're just, and if you don't keep it, you're unjust. And these contracts can be both written and unwritten. And the idea of politeia, or the Republic, is we want to understand what are the series of relationships that make up a contract of people who live together in community. What is held in common versus what is unique to my house or to me. And so the first fundamental aspect of politeia is that what is held as common, there has to be something that governs or regulates the relationships between what is held in common. And that's justice. Justice is what determines what is due to the community as a whole, what is due to the person, and what is due to the other groups, other parts that make up that community. If you understand in logic or in the other philosophical sciences the relationship between the whole and the parts, you can start to understand the nature of a political community and also what the common good is. Right? The political community is the whole. Right? The persons or the other associations or groups or whatnot that make it up are the parts. Justice, you might say, is the contract that exists between them. Now, as soon as you mention this, right, you also see in the beginning of the Republic the challenge that's basically raised in the ancient world between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle on the one hand, and the sophists on the other hand. The two most prominent sophists were Gorgias and Socrates. Socrates, right? If you want to read more about this, you can look in Werner Jaeger, Paideia, Volume 3, more or less pages 25 to 160. And no, it's very interesting history because it gives the whole history, beginning with Socrates, his first challenge, his breaking away from the sophists, and then the history all the way down to Alexander the Great, who breaks with Aristotle and sides with Socrates in order to confect the Greek Empire. And you can see one of the great moments where the position of the sophists is laid out is in Book 1 of the Republic with Thrasymachus, right? Who essentially, there's two basic points of the speech of Thrasymachus in Book 1 of the Republic. One is he says justice is what the powerful determine it to be. And he gives kind of a crass argument of justice is determined by those who have military power, right? And they can determine what it is and what it is not, and make the poor guy or the little guy suffer from it. The other version of injustice, which Thrasymachus defends in the beginning of the Republic, is he says justice is when the unjust man, the sophist, the unjust man, is the one who is able to arrange the economic contracts of a society such that in good times, all the risk is thrown onto the weaker party. And the unjust man takes no risk for himself. He only gets the benefits. And then when society falls apart and the contract is broken, the unjust man is capable of throwing all the risk again, all the punishment, the debt or whatever, onto the weaker party, and he gets off scot-free. So he benefits both in good times and in bad by placing the risk on the weaker party. And this is the height of injustice, which Thrasymachus says, it's injustice that pays, right? So these are the two forms of the unjust man that are given in Book 1 of the Republic. In Book 2 of the Republic, I mean, we're not going to go through Book 1 of the Republic. You read it in many classes as undergraduates. But in Book 2 of the Republic, after Socrates refutes Thrasymachus in Book 1, in Book 2, Glaucon and Adeimantus, they basically challenge Socrates even further. And at one point, Glaucon and Adeimantus essentially say, look, if there is no justice, which we don't think there is, because we're students of sophists, if there is no justice, what should be done? Well, what should be done is that the best thing to do would be to appear to be just to the many, and to set up what looks like a democratic government that satisfies the many, but then to set up behind the scenes clubs which influence the theater and which influence the town criers, because that's all they had at that time, to basically rule from behind the scenes, but to rule following injustice. And these kind of point there's other passages in the Platonic Corpus and in the Politics of Aristotle where these authors present the position of injustice, right, governing society, which is the position of the sophist. And the position of the sophist, I think it could be reduced to kind of, this is what, Jaeger, that's kind of funny. There was a guy at Elmbrook this past year, and he went to Providence with Tom DeAndrea, the famous Tom DeAndrea, for a weekend seminar on whatever. And so I had just told this guy, you don't have to read all of Werner Jaeger's Paideia, which is 3 volumes, 650 pages. I mean, if you have the time, read it. But if you don't have the time, I said, the most important part to read is actually these 100 pages of the 3rd volume. Because that's the real story of the clash between the education of, on the one hand, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, on the other hand, the sophists. And so they were at this little seminar for the weekend, and they were in like the 3rd hour of their dinner at the Italian restaurant. And Tom DeAndrea says, so all of you, he has these sweeping statements that he likes to make. So he says, all of you should read before you graduate from Harvard, right? All 3 volumes of Werner Jaeger's Paideia, right? And so this one guy says, well, Professor Langen told us that all we have to do is read, the 100 pages in volume 3, and we really get the kernel of it. And then Tom says, I won't even dignify that with the response. But then the guy said, well, actually, I know an article that you could read that's just like 10 pages long that actually summarizes the 100 pages in Werner Jaeger. So tell Tom that the next time you see him. Actually, you could read those articles too. John Rayo, this guy John Rayo. He has a website, and he has the Tallinn lectures. And in like the first lecture and a half, he summarizes the 100 pages of Werner Jaeger on Socrates, Aristotle versus the sophists. And it basically comes down to this, right? Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they said there is a human person. The human person is dedicated to a hunt to discover being. If the human person can discover being, the human person can discover justice. We have a standard by which we can judge what is due and what is not due to other persons and to the society as a whole, right? And the whole purpose of life, and also, if we can discover being, we can discover the virtues, And we can the virtues are to the body, are to the soul, what the organs are to the body. But the great thing about the virtues is that we can use our intelligence to grow, you might say, the virtues in our soul. So we can become just beings, and by becoming just beings, we can make the society just. The sophists, they basically took the position that, well, there is no possibility of truth. This hunt for the virtue, or this hunt for being, is absurd, right? There's no possibility really of truth or justice. All we have are our sense perceptions and our instincts. If we let society, if we let everybody just follow their sense perceptions and instincts, it will end in disaster. It'll end in civil war. So what do we need to do? We need to create an enemy. The Persians are always a convenient excuse. We need to create an enemy we need to create an enemy towards which we can direct all the instincts and insane passions of the people. We need to develop a politics that basically satisfies the instincts and passions of the people, sometimes known as bread and circus. The theater. We need to keep the people at close to subsistence level so that they're docile. Basically, we need docile wage slaves who are willing to go into the army to fight once we identify their enemy for them. We need to promote ourselves as having the most beautiful thing in the world, because there's no truth, but there's at least beauty. And what's the most beautiful thing in the world? The Greek language, Greek sculptures, Greek art, and the free institutions of the Greeks, whether those of Sparta or Athens. It doesn't matter, right? And also, we can create a myth that God wants us to use our superior navy, because we have the most superior navy in the world, in order to create an empire in which we will save all of these backward nations by giving them, why are you laughing? This is Werner Jaeger. He's a serious German scholar, right? We need to save these unfree nations by teaching them the beauty of the Greek language, the beauty of Greek culture, and the beauty of free political institutions, right? This way we avoid tendentious questions like the truth, like justice, like trying to organize the relationships between the various persons and groups in a society according to phantasms, according to ghosts, the ghosts that people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle would propose to us. So I think Plato, part of the reason that he writes what he writes is to oppose the sophists. It's to say there is something that's called being, right? There is a divine being. What he creates with a certain harmony or order that we can discover. We also discover, when we discover that harmony or order, that we're not living in conformity with it. And so but the one great thing we have as humans is our intelligence, which we can use to creatively shape ourselves, to bring ourselves into harmony with that order that we can perceive. And in fact, Plato then, I think throughout the Republic and throughout the Laws and his other political writings, he'll go out to say, actually, the most important thing to know about a society, and the most important thing to know, you got to be able to judge where a society is. Well, how do you judge where a society is? You have to look at the soul. You have to learn how to study the souls of the leaders, not only of the political institutions, but you need to study the souls of the leaders of all of the corporate bodies that make up the political community. And I think what he means is something like this, right? I think he means if you look at any society, every society is made up not only of persons, but it's made up of corporate bodies. The family is a corporate body, right? A business is a corporate body. The NFL is a corporate body, right? Trade unions are corporate bodies. Hollywood is a corporate body, right? And also, the Senate is a corporate body, right? Every society is made up of these corporate bodies. And every society, every corporate body has authors. Those who use their intelligence and creativity, and they shape that institution or body. And that usually, in the vast majority of cases, there's always an element of technical proficiency, but there's also an element of the order of the soul of especially of the author or the leader. It's reflected into the institution, into the corporate body. So if you want to know the nature of a constitution or a regime, you don't go study a document. The first thing you study are the souls of the leaders of the corporate bodies of the time in which you're living, or that have. Why? Because what actually happens is that the souls of the leaders, they almost by the force of their authority or the force of their leadership, they create the institution, they create the customs, and they create the culture of those persons who are the part of the corporate body below them, or who form that corporate body. And then, once the custom is the unwritten law, which is oftentimes the most forceful law in a body. Once the customs and culture are kind of set, well then you get the education, you get the educational system. I mean, Aristotle eventually will say, you want to change the laws of a society? Change the music. Right? If you change the music, you'll change the laws. Right? So from the souls of the authors of the corporate bodies, you get the customs and the culture, and then you get the education, and then you get the written laws and the institutions and the juridical order. So the whole purpose of the Republic is to try to come up with a mechanism, a lens, you might say, for looking at and understanding the souls of the leaders that make up the various corporate bodies that make up a society. Right? And I think obviously you can start to make a list. Well, what are the corporate bodies that are formative as far as creating a constitution in any given moment in a society? Well, it's going to be the military, sports, different in different ages, but athletes, entertainment, business, some form of, it's going to be some form of journalism and education, educational institutions. Right? So if you look at these various, if you want to know what a society is like, you need to study the souls of the leaders of these institutions. And if they're dominated by avarice, you'll have an oligarchy, right? If they're dominated by power, you'll have some sort of tyranny. If they're dominated by virtue, you'll have some sort of democracy. If they're dominated by equal access to all the passions, you'll have a democracy. That's what democracy is. I think is what you'll see in the manual, that as we start to the manual is a synthesis of the reflection of, what to say it, classical realists, right, or Catholics, on what are the essential principles to understand the makeup of social and political life. And I think you can reduce them to 4. Number 1 would be the human person. The human person, and we look at the human person as body and soul. capable of self-dominion, but also as part of his nature, in order to grow and to become a healthy human being, a flourishing human being, needs to live in community, not only with just his family, but also with other corporate bodies in society. And it's by and what is justice, or what are rights, understood in this way? What are rights? Rights are a juridical way of defining what that person owes to the other corporate bodies in the society and what they owe to him. And I think like in the life of a numerary, this is important, because like when you're deciding like where to work or how long to work, whether you should stay late at work, it's not just like what would the typical businessman say? The typical businessman would say, who knows nothing about philosophy, who always acts according to his gut, and who thinks, though, that his common sense is justice for the entire world, right? I mean, like as Adam Smith said, right? The poor people, they should be happy to be servants on the tables of the rich, right? Because that's what a common sense businessman would tell you. Of course a poor person should be happy to serve at my tables. I'm doing them a favor, right? Well, but that's not justice, right? When you have to think about, okay, my family needs me for dinner. My work, my business, which is another corporate body, they do have a right to ask me for so much work, but they don't have a right to ask me for a complete life commitment, unlimited work, right? And so the real question is not, what's my common sense feeling about this? I feel bad if I don't go into work, or I feel bad if I have to leave early because my boss feels bad. I mean, the real question is, the first real question is, what does justice require of you? And sometimes it's even the case, because your family's more important. Like, if you look at a family where the kids are sick, right? The dad will sometimes have to come up with ways of saying, well, I got to limit my work to this because I have my family, I have a prior commitment in justice to the good of my family. So I do the absolute minimum of what my job requires of me in justice, right? Because I don't. There's things you can do at work that are beyond what justice requires, which is fine. But it's important, I think, to kind of start to get in your mind, well, not all these bodies have equal claims on me, nor do I owe them all the same. I don't owe my family the same thing I owe to my business, or to my community organizer, whatever that might be. But it means something that different corporate bodies can make claims on you, and you can make claims on them, and they can be limited. Right? And this is where justice comes from. So there is such a thing as social justice, right? Or sometimes social justice is now called solidarity. In other words, when I act in the society, I realize that the society as a whole, I'm a part, and there are all sorts of other parts out there. And I'm concerned about, as I act, I'm concerned about the self, at least the basic self-dominion, and the basic achieving of the good of the other parts in relation to the whole. Yes?
Is solidarity one of the four key ideas?
Yes. Yes. And also, another key idea is then subsidiarity, right? That if there's a part in relation to the whole, if there's a part that can exercise its self-dominion, if it can freely exercise its self-dominion, it ought to be allowed to do so. That the whole owes that to the part.
Father,
Yeah.
is there a difference, or is social justice a certain type of justice, or when they?
Yeah. We'll get to that.
Okay.
We're just kind of laying general guidelines out at this moment. And then, of course, the fourth is the common good. Which, if anyone can show me the founding fathers of this country actually discussing the common good, I would deeply appreciate it. Because I have not found it in my life, in my lifetime so far. Not that I'm like a great scholar, but I'm a lazy scholar, but I still haven't found it. But anyway, but the common good is each of the parts exercising their self-dominion so as to be healthy, happy, and wise. Each of the persons, each of the corporate bodies, and the community as a whole functioning as it should. Maybe to use contemporary logo, sustaining itself, sustainability, right? A healthy moral ecology, a healthy ecological system. Then another point, and just another kind of general point. So those are the four biggest things, right? Finally, there's there's two more points as far as introduction. We want to pay special attention to the political-religious. We want to pay special attention to the political-religious problem. Because just as a matter of justice, the political community, which is created by God, owes something to its creator. Right? Or we humans, because we are created by God and we live in community, we owe something to that which created us. And here we're speaking about natural justice. We're not even talking about the supernatural life, right? And so if there's an authority, if there's a corporate body that's an authority in society that directs worship to God, well, it has a special relationship with. It has it because God is the author of God is the author of all of creation. Right? So it creates a special. There's always a special. This is the only true special relationship that we should be concerned about. Not any other special relationship. Right? So this will be a kind of running theme. And then finally, we want to go through, especially, well, there's all sorts of ways to do this. What I'd propose is that we go through, especially political life, just starting in the 1750s. Because in the 1750s is when it's when you start to get this competition, especially between the British. It's when the British really set out to dominate the world, right, through their empire. And there's competition that they develop with the continental powers. And this competition is articulated both in philosophy and political philosophy, but also in the political and economic lives of the various systems that develop. And part of what we want to do is, just like in ethics, we want to try to get experience. And the way you get experience is by looking at the history with these questions in mind. And there's many ways to do that. And we're just going to start in the 1750s because that's just where I chose to start. But I think also, just in my own sense of the matter is that you see a lot of debates. I've seen a lot of debates I saw a lot of debates in my previous life that dealing on this question of, well, how do we relate to what's happened since the 1750s? Is it good or is it bad? Should we embrace it? Should we throw it out? Should we? How do we deal with, how do we characterize what's happened since the 1750s, and how do we deal with it now that it's happened? So, and then I think it's also actually many of these realities that I just kind of schematically pointed out, justice, the common good, solidarity, subsidiarity. Many of these realities have only really they were really only brought back to the discussion, even in the Catholic world, after the calamity of, well, first, there's no Catholic world in Britain, essentially, until the 19th century, right? But after the calamity, only after really the calamity of the French Revolution, in the Catholic world do you start to see people saying, well, maybe we should go back and like figure out what the first Christians did when they encountered the Roman Empire. Because maybe like society is more now like the Roman Empire than it was however many 200 years ago. And maybe we should discover like what were some of the things that they thought were important that led to the conversion of the Roman Empire and the conversion of political and economic institutions, things like this, where they were at least trying to follow the Gospels, right? And that's part of why, for example, also in the last couple hundred years, this whole reality of the the kingship of Christ has been so emphasized, at least in the last, let's say, 200 years, taken as a whole. There's actually a professor at Harvard who just converted to Catholicism. And the reason he converted is that, well, it's not the only reason he converted, but he said this publicly, right? That what got him over the brink was reading St. Josemaria on the universal kingship of Christ. And he's like, if you're going to be Catholic, the only thing that makes sense is to advance the kingdom of Christ through your profession. And so that's what I got from St. Josemaria, and that's why I became Catholic. Yeah. He's teaching an awesome class this fall in the Harvard Law School.
What is that?
Catholic integralism versus liberalism.
Oh. The Constitution is a joke, probably.
So I want to start with in the 1750s. And I want to start to characterize, well, clearly by the 1750s. So just first of all, I've discovered in doing research for this, I've discovered that.
Sorry, Father Jeff. Do we want to take the break now or at the end or what?
There's only one today.
Oh,
There's only one?
Well, there's one today and two tomorrow, or there's two today and one tomorrow. Whatever you want. Huh?
Schedule. Let's be orderly.
Okay. So, but we started late.
Okay, start.
So I gotta go. You gotta give me a few extra minutes. So,
That was a cookie.
but anyway, by the 1750s in the Catholic world, so you're here learning Thomism. There's no Thomism. There's very little Thomism in the Catholic world, even in, let's say, France. Take France, right? There's very little Thomism, right? I mean, there is Thomism in some schools, right? But as far as like the general education that you would receive by the 1750s, you would receive a strong foundation in the political and economic thought of John Locke, of British empiricism. You would be taught that like all we can really know about you is that you're a bunch of sense perceptions.
This is England you're talking about?
This would be England, France, Spain, Italy, Austria, Germany, Poland, Russia, the Ottoman. Well, they didn't teach philosophy in the Ottoman Empire. But no, but I mean, so like first of all, you're basically being taught that you are sense perceptions, right? You're basically sense perceptions and instincts. And at best, if you're a moderate, you're being taught, well, you can come up with some sort of rules, right? You can come up with some sort of rules to guide or regulate your sense perceptions and instincts. That's what we call rights and laws, right? I mean, so basically you could say, in a very cheap way, right? According to a classical realist, there's an ideal. This is how we ought to be. This is how we are. We can, by some authority, training in virtue, discovering justice, learning philosophy, blah, 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 and with the help of some authority, you can go from where you are, and you can, in various ways, implement law, virtue, order, harmony, deepen your understanding of being, right? You can use all that to kind of grow closer to the ideal, which you can also discover, the common good, justice, blah, 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 right? Well, of course, after the Reformation, after William of Ockham, the Reformation, what you are, at best, you're not someone capable of virtue anymore. You're just instincts and sense perceptions. If you're a Lockean or if you're a Calvinist, your instincts and sense perceptions are evil, and they can never be considered good. You can never do good, right? What Rousseau does is Rousseau comes along in the 1750s, and he says, well, what they all called evil, I'm just going to call it good. Your sense perceptions and instincts, but that's a good thing. And in fact, you should look deeper into your feelings and your emotions to kind of know precisely the goodness that's within you. And you need to get rid of anything that's in civilization that prevents you from looking into your emotions and feelings, because then you won't be free. Right? Now, what radicals will say, all by this point, that's the liberal position, right? That's what you're learning, even in the Catholic world, for the most part. Right? That's the liberal position, or the moderate liberal position. The liberal position is also saying all these old bodies, all these old corporate bodies that, where people argue over rights and justice and, oh, you owe this and I owe that to this body and that body. All these old associations, these confraternities, these guilds, right? Unions, all these things need to be obliterated. Why? Because they're false creations of the past system of despotism and priestcraft, right? So if you're a moderate liberal, you're someone that says, well, yeah, we're just sense perceptions and rules and instincts, but we can just kind of, over time, we can kind of create new ways of thinking, and we can slowly chip away at all these old corporate bodies. If you're a radical liberal, you're basically someone who says, well, no, we should just have a revolution, and we should just get rid of all these corporate bodies in one fell swoop, including things like churches, religion, and the family, because those two are corporate bodies that are just false creations of the system of priestcraft, despotism, and however else we want to label what came before. Yes?
Just a question. With the thing of like getting rid of the guilds and the authority or whatever. So how does that just relate to the earlier point of that we have this arrow with the authority here of getting you to the ideal? This is something different, or?
Yeah, for them there's no ideal, and all authority is despotism, priestcraft.
Okay, who was the diagram for? That was for someone else?
This would be like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates,
Oh.
Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, Saint Anthony of Padua, Saint Anthony of Florence, Saint Bernardino of Siena, John Capistrano, Savonarola. Right? So the more radical ones tend to be, we got to get rid of everything, right? And the sooner the better. And actually, I just learned this, and I was actually quite shocked. To some degree, we don't know. This is always a question in modern philosophy. Well, what were the Catholics saying to these modern philosophers? To some degree, we don't know. And the reason to some degree we don't know is because between the years 1790 and 1820, today being the anniversary of the French Revolution, right? Between the years 1790 and 1820, and also beginning even before that, and all the so-called, and a lot of times these efforts were led by the so-called good Christian rulers of Europe, right? But in this time, in the interest of advancing liberalism, right? In this time, in the interest of advancing liberalism, they among all the monasteries and libraries that they tore down and they burned or destroyed, 300 million books. 300 million books. So you could take almost any, like whenever in modern day campuses, they have these like, come read a book that's been censored or destroyed throughout history. You could take almost any book from the Middle Ages and you could just start reading it. Because you liberals, you destroyed it. You committed a great crime against humanity. You committed a greater crime against humanity than the Muslims did when they burned, and they didn't even burn it, the Library at Alexandria. It was burned already before the Muslims came through, right? You are worse than the Muslims. You wretched liberals. And on that point, we will end today.